Welcome back to the Mom Empowerment Podcast. I'm Iethar,
And I'm Ramatan.
and we are so happy to have you tune in to part two of our episode on mom guilt. So, since our last conversation revolving around, what is mom guilt and, how do we tackle it? How do we make room to process those feelings of mom guilt? But then, what do we do next? Now that we know what it is and how it can show up, what do we do next? How do we reframe that guilt? And this is what we're going to cover a little bit more today. So first off, what are the common triggers of mom guilt? And part of it is that sense of feeling where we're not present with our kids 24/7, and where we feel like we might be missing out on certain parts of our children's upbringing, like their milestones or whatnot, and then that guilt kind of weighs on us. Um, there's also that feeling of going back to work or not having a career where we might feel like that shift of we feel guilty of going back and again not being there for our kids, but then also maybe not being interested in going back and then comparing ourselves to working moms and being like, oh, well, I don't have a career, like who am I? And then we feel that different sense of guilt. Um, there's a lot of mom guilt around moments where we show ourselves self-compassion, where we decide to take care of ourselves, take time for ourselves, but then carry the weight of, "Oh, I feel so guilty, I should have been spending more time with them, maybe I'm being a selfish mom." So we start to again spiral into those negative thoughts of maybe I'm not worthy of taking time out of myself, my family needs me. There's also the whole era of being moms during social media, and so comparing ourselves often with what is a perfect mom? What does that super mom look like? And how can I be like them even though those that are online are not necessarily showing all of their authentic self, because that's what social media is. And
We're,
so
we're setting like unrealistic expectations, basically.
exactly. And so we only sometimes see the good parts of being a influencer, but we don't necessarily see what happens behind the scenes, and it doesn't give us a fair image. There's a lot of also mom guilt around, the parenting styles, the different access to information about how we should be parenting, how we should be, being present as moms for our kids. So either breastfeeding, formula, baby-led weaning, spoon feeding, sleep training, not sleep
Yeah.
training, gentle parenting versus
Daycare,
more, yeah,
no daycare.
daycare, no daycare, exactly. So there's a lot around that, and just repeating these out loud since our last discussion. Did you feel any of these mom guilts?
Of course, every day. Every day.
I know I can literally check every single of these
Yes,
triggers and they show
exactly.
up at different moments.
Yeah,
And so, the question to be asking ourselves now is, what do we do with it? How do we
yeah.
reframe it? Do we just say, oh, I feel guilty and stay stuck, or there's something that we can do?
I think it's important to understand like the difference between guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
So guilt basically it's feeling responsible for something, something that you see negatively. So this often relates to like specific actions or failures, whereas shame, it's you feel inadequate as a person. So for mothers, this could involve like, um, I chose to not breastfeed my child, so therefore I am a bad mom
Mm-hmm.
overall. So it's not looking at this little aspect of motherhood as one thing. It's looking as the you as a mom as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
We're going to cover for sure the aspect of shame in a different topic in its own, because it is a deeper subject matter.
Yeah.
But really, yes, it is important to really look at the difference between, am I feeling guilt or am I feeling shame? Because with shame, it's even harder to talk about. It's harder to talk about because there's a lot of internal work of, what do I do with these feelings? Where is it stemming from? It is more deep versus guilt. It, it could sometimes, it's more of the societal expectation versus, that feeling of being inadequate. Um, when it comes to, the guilt and shame, it's also important to really look at what are the triggers for each.
Yeah.
So when we look at guilt, again, we kind of touched on it where we're looking at what are the standards. Maybe we're not meeting them. So breastfeeding versus formula, for example, and then we compare ourselves to others. Whereas with shame, when we're comparing ourselves to others, it's kind of associated to what is the perception that we're attaching to it of what does a perfect mom look like. And
Hmm.
so again, we're like, it's more of an internal struggle. And then we might end up finding ourselves comparing ourselves to somebody else and being
Hmm.
like, I'm so ashamed. I'm not like up to par to what this person is doing. It's not that we're not feeling guilty about it. We're feeling very
Yeah.
shameful. And it's like, we don't want to admit it. And that's what could also build up some of that resent, envy, jealousy. And that could actually rift people
Yeah.
apart, because they feel like
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
wouldn't we fall into judgment or anything like that. Um, Even with when we're looking at guilt and shame, it's the impact that it has on our mental health. That's
Yeah.
also um, something to keep in mind. And for example, with guilt, sometimes it could motivate when you feel guilty about something. You might actually be motivated to change a behavior because, like, I don't want to feel this guilt anymore,
Yeah.
and so you might do something about it.
Yeah.
Whereas with shame, because it's so deep and intrinsic,
Yeah.
um, you end up possibly falling into a sense of worthlessness.
Yeah.
And, this is where we have to pay attention to signs of depression. It makes it so hard to actually ask for help.
Yeah. The something that comes to mind when you're talking about like a guilt that could be a motivating factor is when and this happens to everybody, like
Mm.
there's no shame in it, but when you catch yourself being impatient with your kids
Mm.
and you feel such shame because you don't want to be impatient with them, but sometimes it it's bigger than you.
Mm-hmm.
And but the guilt can actually motivate you to look into okay strategies of how can I deal with a situation like this in a better way,
Mm-hmm.
kind of, so that you don't feel that kind of shame anymore. You know?
Absolutely. That's a great example. And then whereas with shame, because it's so deep that you're like, I don't even want to say it out loud
Yeah,
because I would be a really horrible person.
exactly.
Um, so again, things to kind of take into account. Um, we kind of touched on the cultural differences. So different cultures have different expectations of mom, and that could also contribute to the feelings of either guilt or shame. So it's very important to, take the time to self-reflect on where does it show up for you, be it culturally within guilt or within that shame, and to kind of just sometimes it's important to pinpoint it and name it as to what it is so that
Yeah.
when we're going to share with you how to reframe it and what are the tips and tricks, kind of more what to work on. um, and then we look at the coping strategies, but we're going to touch on that when we come back to the tips and tricks.
One way of reframing the guilt is to ask yourself when you're getting these feelings of mom guilt, is this guilt or is it an unrealistic expectation?
Mm-hmm.
And another question would be, would I judge another mom for this? Because we tend to be so kind to other people, but when it comes to ourselves, we're harsh. We put unrealistic expectations. We set the bar too high, and then we get disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
So, whenever you're getting these feelings, ask yourself, is it guilt or unrealistic expectations? And would I judge another mom for this?
It's interesting. I'm going to play the devil's advocate and say, like the question of would I judge another mom for this? There might be situations where you might find yourself judging another mom. But this
Yeah,
is the part
that's
where
true.
we have to reframe our mindset, and it's to say, am I judging this mom because I feel guilty for my own, you
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
am I projecting on something? Like, am I
Mm-hmm.
feeling guilty? And so it's easier for me to judge somebody than to reflect on it? Or am I judging this mom based on unrealistic expectations? Like
Yeah,
maybe again, I'm attaching my own perception of what this mom should be doing, but then again, I'm projecting my own type of insecurities. So then it becomes easier to judge that mom. So even there, it's to catch ourselves too, where we might end up judging somebody else, but then we have to kind of reframe it and say, okay, but this mom is also going through their own thing. Like
Yeah.
whatever their reason belongs to them,
Yeah.
you know? But it's important to state, like, be more mindful of the way that we react to other moms too, because that actually contributes to our own guilt, because that's where that sense of shortcomings also happens, because we're comparing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't break that cycle between moms, then we're all going to keep feeling that
Exactly.
mom guilt.
Yeah, definitely. So to release that guilt, I know we've discussed this before, but the self compassion
Mm-hmm.
really does play a huge role in releasing that guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to yourself the way you would talk to a friend. Again, focus on your strength. When you catch yourself thinking negatively, replace the thought with a positive affirmation. So when you're thinking, oh, like I'm not good enough, I'm leaving my kids, I'm going to work, like all these negative thoughts, you tell yourself, I'm doing my best, I'm capable, I'm a good mom, I'm doing this for my kids. Just reframing it in a positive way, because we really are all just really doing our best.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing would be to set realistic expectations. So letting go of the idea of perfectionism. Nobody's perfect. Um, Nora Roberts has a theory called the glass ball versus plastic ball theory for priorities. So
Mm.
basically, if you're holding, the way you think about it is if you're holding a glass ball and it falls, it's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big priority. But if you're holding a plastic ball and it falls, nothing's gonna happen. It's not a big deal. So if you think you feel like you have too much to do, then separate like the glass ball from the plastic ball
Mm-hmm.
in your priorities. So that, let's say you don't get to this thing today, if it's a plastic ball, it's not a big deal,
Yeah.
right? And you're only really focusing on the things that really need to get done.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And it's also interesting because sometimes from a distance, a glass ball and a plastic ball might look alike.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like, it kind of goes back to what do you need and versus what you
Yeah.
want. And to really look at what is really that important, and to look closely of what is
Exactly.
a plastic ball versus a glass one. And um, that way you know where to put your energy of something that's,
Exactly.
a better return on your own investment in terms of energy and care and stuff like that.
Yeah. Definitely.
Uh, but kind of touching to our first part where we talk about social media, it becomes very like uh, almost grade where we can't see very well what is
Yeah.
a glass ball
It's true.
versus the plastic one, because we're fed so much information. So again, that's why it's, to your point, it's important to kind of reframe that and put that into perspective.
Another tip would be to stop comparing yourself to others. I know this is a really hard one with social media because you're feeding your brain with all this information, all these different perspectives. For me,
Mm,
I feel like really I have a hard time watching parenting videos. Like, I don't know if other moms go through this, but I really have a hard time watching parenting videos because there's so much conflicting information out there.
mm,
Do you gentle parent? Do are you more like discipline? Are you
mm,
more in between? And everybody's telling you the other theory is wrong. So I have a hard time listening to them. I actually don't really listen to them. If I'm looking for tips or tricks, I look for very specific things. um, but again, it comes down to not comparing yourself to others, and also, we need to learn to um, not take in all the information that we're fed as if it were true,
yeah,
right? Because what's right for me might not be right for you.
absolutely.
So yeah, does that happen to you too?
Absolutely, because there's that information overload, and you're like, okay, but I don't know what's right or wrong, and then that's where I find myself also falling into that judgment sometimes,
Yeah,
because the thing is, I'm also trying to figure things out, so then I make a decision based on what I think makes sense, and then I fall into that insecurity of like, what is the wrong decision? So
exactly.
that's why it's easier to fall into judgment, because they're
Yeah,
like, okay, but I just made like this work, but that's the part where reframing of like, it works for me and my family doesn't mean it's going to work for somebody
exactly.
else. So
Yeah,
um But sometimes it's the way that we present things to one another that might appear like it's coming from a place of judgment. But, and I think I've shared this quote with you, but every expression of anger, criticism, or judgment is usually
Mm-hmm.
related to an unmet need.
Yeah.
So then if I have that need for a validation, I might come across as judging somebody else because I'm trying to feel more secured in my own decision,
Yeah.
but it might not, it might harm somebody else. And that's why, again, we have to be more mindful of the way that we fall into that comparison because it might seem little to us, but it has a bigger
Yeah.
impact on somebody else.
It's important to also identify the sources of guilt.
Mm,
So, is it your own thoughts? Is it someone else's judgment? Is it someone in your surroundings that's judging you?
mm,
Uh, is it social media? Is it the too much information that you're being fed? And to let go of those that don't serve you. So if it's somebody in your surroundings that keeps judging you, telling you, "Oh, how can you not breastfeed your kid, or how can you send your kid to daycare, or how could you do this? Why don't you just homeschool?" Um, you need to let go of whatever does not serve you. If it's your own thoughts, then you learn to identify those thoughts when they're happening and
mm-hmm.
reframe them like we were discussing. And social media, it's to recognize that there is so much information out there and not all of it is true.
Mm,
Because our brains sometimes they don't recognize that. They take everything we give them as true.
mm-hmm.
So we need to really be conscious about that and conscious about what we're feeding our brain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the source of guilt, if it's because it's somebody that judged us, it's learning to unshackle ourselves from that person's judgment
Yeah,
because again, it says more about their own experiences or their own
exactly.
insecurities or their own worries. So again, when we reframe it, we're like, sometimes we need to depersonalize it.
Yeah,
And if we're unsure, and it's a hard thing to do, it's to clarify it with the person.
yeah,
Sometimes that's how we set boundaries and stand up
yeah.
for ourselves too as
Speak up.
moms,
Yeah.
to speak up. And it doesn't speaking up doesn't mean it has to become aggressive
No,
or
no, no.
confrontational or anything like that. But if something made us uncomfortable and hurt us as a mom, we can say, you know, we can address it. There's different ways to communicate that to somebody and say,
Yeah,
I just want to understand when you say this, what did you mean by it? Because this is
yeah,
how I received it
yeah.
and it actually
Definitely.
hurt me. And so, like, practicing that, it's a muscle. It's not that easy,
No.
but it is one way to kind of reframe the guilt because sometimes it doesn't belong to us.
Yeah, exactly. So talking with other moms definitely helps. That's why we created this podcast in the first place, because we needed help. We needed
Yeah.
to talk about these things and build the community that we are lacking.
Mm-hmm.
But if even if it's just to pick up the phone and call your friend when you're having a bad day or getting these negative thoughts, and just talking about it, it always feels better afterwards. Even though like the friend didn't necessarily like say anything you didn't know already, but it does help.
Yeah.
Therapy or journaling is also a great way to work through your feelings and identify the triggers and learn how to deal with them and cope with them.
Well, you know me. I'm a big advocate for therapy as well. Talking to other moms is one thing, but therapy, if you feel comfortable for it with it and you find somebody that you feel comfortable that understands you, because that's part of the struggle. The first session,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when you go to a therapist, you just feel like, "Okay, this person is not understanding me," and you might feel like it's not clicking or jiving, and then you have to kind of find that person that you connect with. But speaking from my own experience, I find that having a space where the person has um, no nothing to lose by just listening to you and help you dive into your own triggers. You're better understanding the things that you're kind of going through. And like oftentimes there's this conception that therapy means like I'm really unwell, my mental health
Yeah,
is breaking down. I need to be depressed to be able to go see a therapist, or I need to
yeah,
be at this extreme. But going to therapy is also a form of prevention.
yeah,
It's one of the like I've done it before, but before becoming a mom, when I was pregnant, it was something I did because I knew postpartum depression was a big thing. I knew that depression could also just show up at any time. So I wanted to be preventive and talk about it because for me, it's easy to talk about these things, maybe because of my own field of work. But it just allowed me to reframe things. And as you're talking, you start to know yourself better. But if you don't have the space to talk about these things yourself, or you don't have a confidant or a friend that you feel comfortable talking about things, then you don't have somebody else to reflect back things to you. And that's why therapy could be beneficial for some people. Again, you know, we might have a privilege to have, like friendship that we have, but for some moms, they really don't have necessarily a village and they don't really know who to. You might have a village like of people, but a confidant is very different. And so I just wanted to kind of take a moment to say that if you do decide to seek therapy, there's no shame in that either. And it might be more beneficial to you than you would think. And if you decide to try it out and it's not speaking to you, then that's okay too. At least now you know. You know what works for you and what doesn't.
The last thing I want to say around this topic is really to just forgive yourself for past mistakes, focus on the present, really be present every day, and celebrate your parenting wins every day, even the little wins. Let's say we're in a situation with your kids and this time you weren't impatient, celebrate that. Give yourself a pat on the back and tell yourself, good job. You were able to diffuse the situation and not be impatient.
Absolutely. Now that we kind of looked at, some of the tricks to help us reframe things, other things that we kind of wanted to touch on quickly is positive affirmations. And when we say positive affirmations, it's not as a way to neglect the negative feelings because we need to process them, we need to feel them, but we don't want them to fester inside of us. So how can we say an affirmation that allows us to push through that negative feeling? So one of the things that I find myself sometimes saying when I feel like I'm having a hard time making a decision, for example, it's I'm doing what is best for me and my family. This is what works for us. So I'm doing what's best for me and for my family. And it might not make sense for anyone else, but it makes sense for me.
Exactly.
Is there something that you use sometimes?
Me, it's more I'm doing my best with what I have. It's okay to have moments of doubt. They don't diminish me as a mom.
Another one that sometimes I tell myself is, I'm also learning and unlearning. Because definitely. Whatever I thought I knew about motherhood before becoming a mom,
completely different.
Exactly. So I'm still figuring things out. So that's why I repeat that, I'm also learning and unlearning. We kind of touched on this, that sense of having that sense of community, mom friends, support groups. So whatever that makes sense for you, for some people, they might not feel comfortable really. So like, talking in a public setting with other moms or whatnot. So if you have more of a smaller set of friends, share with them. Sometimes we feel like we don't feel comfortable sharing maybe with mom friends, and having that anonymous aspect helps. So maybe on like Facebook groups, on groups like, there's so many like support groups that exist as well, where like forums and stuff like that, that could be a mechanism. Or of course, reaching out to the mom empowerment moms. We're here to create that space for you. Just really accepting the fact that that sense of imperfection is part of parenting. So we're going to keep making mistakes. And, to Ramatan's point of celebrating the wins is that to be able to celebrate those wins, we need to also accept that we're going to make mistakes. And they're part of our learning process as parents, because the only way to become a better parent is to acknowledge we made a mistake and it's okay. And sometimes, exactly. And sometimes a mistake seems like a mistake to us, but it might not be for somebody else, So that's why reframing is important as well.
We don't need to be perfect. We just need to show up every day and give it our best.
Absolutely.
We'd love to hear from you. If you can send us a DM or comment on the post that we're posting on Instagram. Let us know how you experience mom guilt. If you've ever experienced mom guilt, and what mom guilt means to you and how do you cope with it.
I actually wanted to partly end with a quote from Dr. Gabor Mate, who is he's an author, he's a physician, author, and he's an expert on trauma, and he
Yeah.
talks a lot about aspects of compassion and motherhood, and he also says that we don't heal in isolation, but in relationship.
Mm.
And so that's why, when we encourage you to connect with us or to connect with other moms, it's because it allows us to also heal
Yeah.
uh, in a way that we might dismiss sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's a very important way to stay connected.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to us. And we hope you stay tuned on our next episode where we're going to really talk about something that is dear to our hearts. And it's really the way that motherhood transforms us, how it changes us, how we become this whole other version of ourselves that we might have not even anticipated. And it
Yeah.
kind of like shocks you sometimes. You're like, I didn't think I was going to
Yeah.
do this or that. But before I dive into the subject matter, because I get carried away,
Yeah.
I'm just going to stop here and say, tune in to our
Next
third
episode.
episode on how motherhood transforms us. Subscribe, leave a review for us, leave a comment, tell us if there's any other subjects that you'd like for us to bring up, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram, share with other moms that might benefit from these discussions and that want to feel seen and heard as well in their experience of motherhood. So thank you all.
Thank you for tuning in.
See you next time.